This video is recorded for EDX 1250 students. It's in lieu of a Blackboard Collaborate tutorial session which was intended for the 20th of November, but unfortunately we had some technical glitches. So this isn't going to be an interactive session, which is a shame. However, I will ask you at times to pause the video and reflect, and hopefully you get a lot out of it that will help you for assignment 1. What I'd like to take you through are the design elements and design principles. The reason being that these are the building blocks of artworks, and when we understand them, it enables us to be able to engage with artworks and to discuss them more readily. And that's going to be very helpful for your assignment 1, where you need to review your group members' artwork. So I liken the elements and principles to a recipe. The elements are what is put together, the ingredients. So the ingredients that artists use are lines, colors, shapes, textures, and values. The method, the way they put them together, includes balance, rhythm, proportion, contrast, and pattern. So as I go through these elements and principles in this video, hopefully it will help you to gain an understanding of how each artist actually puts these things together and their choices of how they do it, and in doing so, those individual creative choices creates meaning. I've taken this terminology all from Judith Dinham's textbook, the Visual Arts chapter. So at any point in the semester, if you want to refresh your mind on the elements and principles, you can go to her chapter. So Judith Dinham says, line has length, width, direction, and texture. So I'd like you to pause the video and spend a little bit of time engaging with Kandinsky's artwork here. Some people say that he paints what music would look like if we could see it. But what I'd particularly like you to focus upon is Kandinsky's use of line. I want you to find as many different lines as you can and describe them. Write a list of the kinds of lines that he's used. Now, you'll come up with a few descriptions really quickly and easily, but see how creative you can get with your description of lines. So hopefully you have paused and you have engaged with that. What I would like you to reflect on is the fact that you have started to develop what we call an aesthetic vocabulary. You've started to focus on ways of describing what you see, and in doing so you've engaged more deeply with the artwork. So developing an aesthetic vocabulary with your students is a really important tool that helps them to see and describe the world more clearly, and as they do so, they begin to see things they may not have noticed before and to appreciate it more. And hopefully some of the words that you used acknowledged the length, width, direction, and texture of the lines in this artwork. Line can also be used to outline and create pattern, texture, and shading. I think this artwork here is a really intriguing example of an artist's very purposeful use of line. Notice how the very top half of the Cheyenne Indian is completely painted, but the rest of the artwork is just done created by line. What effect does that have for you? Why do you think the artist chose to do that? Is there a story that it begins to create in your mind? Line can also be used to suggest movement or perspective or moods. And certainly in this artwork, I think you'll agree that Van Gogh has very effectively used line to create a sense of movement and mood. We get the sense that the wind is really howling across this village. We can see the trees being tossed in that wind. There's a very strong sense of a foreboding, dark, windy night, and he has done that using static lines and yet done so in a way that it creates this sense of energy, vibrancy, and movement. Okay, we're moving on to color now. Now, it may feel like I'm racing through these. What I hope that you'll do is on most slides that you'll actually stop and you'll spend time interacting with the artwork and looking for that particular design element in it and beginning to gain an appreciation of it. So when it comes to color, we can categorize it as primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. There's a couple of schools of thought on what actually constitutes tertiary colors. Some artists say that a tertiary color is where you might have two parts of one primary color and only one part of the other, so that it tends more towards one primary. So the one closest to yellow would be a tertiary color, with orange being a secondary. That's one school of thought. That's how Judith Dinham explores it. Others actually say that tertiary colors are when we mix three primary colors together, which gives us different forms of brown. I think what's most important for you to understand is that you know what your primary colors are and you know what the secondary colors are and how to create them. Color can have hue, value, and intensity. So looking at the top of the screen at the example of hue, which is just merely the coloration. So we might say it has a red hue or a green hue. It's what color has been chosen. Andy Warhol is an artist who plays with coloration or hues magnificently to create vibrant artworks. Color can also have value. That's its dark or light aspect. And there's a really lovely example here. Joseph writes, "An experiment on a bird in the air pump." And you can see how he uses a combination of values in order to create focus and intrigue in his artworks. And we're going to look at this artwork a little bit more later on. Color can also have intensity. That's its dullness or its vibrancy. And you can see in these two artworks here how the artists have intentionally chosen either vibrant or dull intensity, and how it generates feeling. So if you look at Gauguin's joyousness, you can see he's chosen really vibrant colors to create a sense of a tropical paradise, this kind of utopic way of living. It's vivid, it's vibrant. It's almost like you could smell the flowers. Everything is piquing the senses. Put that beside Claude Monet's water lilies, and you can see how he has very intentionally chosen very dull, muted colors, and in doing so has generated this very serene and peaceful feeling. So an artist's choice of how they use color creates or generates meaning. Color can also be used to create mood and perspective. So I'd like you to pause the video at this point and to consider, how has this artist used color to create mood and perspective? What mood do you see portrayed? And how has color been used to enhance that? Moving on now to shape. Shapes can be organic and geometric. So geometric shapes are those ones that have, I guess, a mathematical formula to them, your circles, squares, dodecahedrons, etc. But then organic shapes are those that are free form. Now all objects have shapes, and you may have seen some art books that help people to learn to draw by seeing objects as different shapes. And shape can be classified as positive or negative. And as a lovely little example of this, we've got this mind bender on screen here. Do you see the chalice first, or do you see the faces? So whatever you see first, that's what your brain is interpreting as the positive space, and then the area around it being the negative space. We'll talk about this a little bit more later on, just the implications that positive and negative space can have for the meaning artists create in their artworks. Shape can also be arranged to give the illusion of depth or three-dimensionality. This is a really lovely example of that. You can see how the shapes of the figures in the artwork have been positioned in such a way that we get a very strong sense of things that are closer to us and things that are further away. So when an object is lower in the artwork, it gives a sense that it's closer to us. So you can see the man's legs feel like they are closest to us. And there's also that idea of overlapping. So when one shape overlaps another, it feels closer, such as the dog overlapping the man. Then there are things like shapes becoming a little bit more less distinct. So if you look at the boat further away in the background, it's less distinct and also smaller, therefore creating that illusion of three-dimensionality. And two-dimensional shapes appearing as three-dimensional shapes are said to have form or mass. I think this Salvador Dali artwork is a really fantastic example of this particular point. So we have a couple of two-dimensional shapes that are the same, but the artist has rendered them in such a way that they appear three-dimensional and therefore as having form or mass. So you can see that the replication of shapes here, the hand holding the egg is the same shape as the human figure crouching over their knee. But the way that Dali has rendered them shows them to have form or mass that helps them to appear as very different objects. Now on to texture. This refers to the surface quality, which can be tactile, meaning that you could actually touch it and feel it, or texture can be implied. So pause the video for a second and consider which of these two artworks do you see as implied and which do you see as tactile. So that was not too mentally taxing, I think, in that we could certainly feel like we could run our fingers through the ermine on Henry VIII's rather sumptuous vestments there, and we could feel the jewel-encrusted brocade. However, that is merely implied texture by an amazing artist. Whereas the Pieta by Michelangelo, you could actually run your hands along the lines of that marble, feeling the folds in Mary's gown there. So I referred earlier to value as one element of color, but it is so important that it is also considered a design element in its own right. So this is the light and dark factor of an artwork, and it can be classified as high key or a light artwork, mid key or a low key artwork, a very dark one. There's, I guess, conjecture as to whether you would consider this a low-key artwork or perhaps a combination. But certainly Joseph Wright has used value in this artwork and indeed in all of his artworks in amazing and intriguing ways. He uses light to cast our focus upon certain aspects of an artwork in ways that make them very intriguing. This particular artwork is a really lovely one to engage in with a class because there's a real story going on. So I would really encourage you to pause the video and just spend a little bit of time looking at this artwork, letting your eyes explore it and starting to think about what's the story here? What's actually going on in this artwork? And as you're doing that, remember to think about how the artist has used value to enhance the story that he is telling. Finally, value is effective in creating the effect of light falling on a surface. So it can be used in a two-dimensional work to create the illusion of three-dimensionality. And we saw that very clearly in Salvador Dali's work earlier on. On to the design principles now, the way that these design elements can be put together by an artist. One of these is balance. It's that visual effect that gives a sense that all is right in relation to other parts of the artwork. Sometimes if you were to look at an artwork and you feel it's not quite right, consider if perhaps it needs something in the artwork to give that sense of balance to it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be symmetrical, because as you can see, I've got 3 examples of artworks here, all of them exploring the idea of balance. One of them is symmetrical, one of them radial, and one of them asymmetrical. So pause the video and have a think about which one is which and why each one of them has that sense of balance. Balance can be deliberately subverted to create a sense of discordancy. And this is a really excellent example of that. The artist has very deliberately created an unbalanced artwork where everything is over in one part of the artwork, leaving the rest leaving the rest empty. But that creates in itself a very strong impression. So I talked earlier about positive and negative space. And this artwork is an excellent example of that, where we have the positive shape, which is the figure of the elderly gentleman, and then all around him is the negative space. And it's almost like it's crowding in on him or overwhelming him. It's highlighting his aloneness. And because the artist has deliberately subverted balance, it generates a story. There's additional meaning. Have a think about this artwork. If the gentleman were placed in the center of the artwork, would it have had the same effect? Now, I think it wouldn't have. And that's a really great example of balance at work and how this design principle has been used to generate meaning. Rhythm or repetition refers to the way elements flow together or contrast, and also to the way the eye is led through or around an artwork. What I'd like you to do is to pause the video and just look at this artwork and take notice of where your eye travels and what is the last thing that you notice in this artwork. And then reflect upon that process of why your eye traveled around the artwork the way it did and how that has created additional layers of meaning for you. There is a classroom snapshot of this particular artwork in the textbook, really well worth engaging with, for the way in which a teacher has utilized this artwork to engage the students in some fantastic arts learning. Rhythm or repetition can be smooth or discordant and create different mood effects. It can be created by repetition of art elements, directions of lines, or progression of shapes. So have a look at this particular artwork. How would you describe the rhythm and repetition in it? Would you describe it as smooth or discordant? What mood does it create for you? How has the artist's use of repetition generated a mood or a feeling or meaning for you? Proportion is described as the relative size and placement of components to each other. This example of Guernica by Pablo Picasso is showing very nicely how he has subverted proportion. He's made things out of proportion. That's quite a trademark of his, and in doing so generates something unique that is quintessentially Picasso. In this particular artwork, his use of proportion, on his distortion of it, creates a very violent and evocative image about the effects of war, the horrific effects of war. And his use of proportion, or his subversion of that, contributes to that horror we feel. When we consider proportion as scale, it contributes to creating a spatial relationship between things to create three-dimensionality, and it can also refer to the size of the artwork to the viewer and surroundings. There's a really great example here, The Awakening, which has been featured in a number of American movies, and the sheer scale of this artwork makes it quite overpowering. If you were to see this particular artwork in a much smaller size, I doubt it would have that same effect. So you can see how in this particular circumstance, the proportion of the artwork is a very intentional choice of the artist that gives it additional meaning or power. Moving on now to contrast, which is created by using the extremes of art elements. So earlier on, Joseph Wright's work, light and dark. You might have very, very patterned areas contrasted with very plain areas in an artwork. So it is a dynamic force, and it adds interest and meaning to an artwork and can create emphasis on particular aspects of an artwork. So Vermeer's girl with the pearl earring, that very plain, dark background, contrasted again the very light, light-filled face. It intensifies our focus on her face and her beauty and her purity. And finally, pattern. Quite an easy one to understand. Repetition of lines, shapes, and other objects to create a surface or filled effect. It can be regular or irregular, organic or geometric, and can be composed of different combinations of repeat patterns. So we have one example here of a very geometric artwork, which is Mondrian's composition with red, blue, and yellow. He was quite imaginative with his titles, as you can see. So that brings me to the end of this crash course in the design elements and principles. But hopefully you've understood through the process of me going through these that they never work in isolation. I've looked at particular design elements and principles in different artworks, but no doubt you will have seen other elements and principles also at work in those artworks. And that's because the artists are combining them creatively for their own unique artworks. And that's what you're going to be doing in your artwork creation. So I encourage you to familiarize yourself with these, and then as you're engaging in the review process of your peers' artwork, to have the design elements and principles open beside you so that you can really be thinking about them and using those concepts to help you identify what your peer has done in their artwork, and then to help you analyze what effect that might be creating for you. So I hope this has been helpful, and thank you very much for listening.